Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime Adventures in Nature Lab program. I am Beth Erickson from the State Museum of Pennsylvania, and our topic today is the American eels in the Susquehanna River Basin. With us is Aaron Henning from the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. He is a fisheries biologist. Hello, Aaron, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Beth. Appreciate the invitation to be part of the program. Look forward to talking to everybody about eels today.
Well, why don't you start by telling us what the Susquehanna River Basin Commission is and what you do there?
Sure. So the Susquehanna River Basin Commission is a government agency formed by the three basin states, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, plus the federal government represented by the Army Corps of Engineers. Our mission is to enhance public welfare through comprehensive planning, water supply allocation, and management of the water resources of the Susquehanna River Basin. So basically, we regulate large water withdrawals from surface water and groundwater sources, coordinate how it's allocated and used. So we have a bunch of hydrologists and engineers that do that stuff, compliance folks that oversee those big consumptive users, but also a few biologists, environmental scientists who do a lot of monitoring work. We also support our fellow resource agencies a lot, like Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, PADP, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So as you mentioned, I'm a fisheries biologist, so I study the fish of the basin. I also help out other fisheries biologists from the basin states with their fisheries issues. One of those issues is improving fish passage at dams, which is how I first got involved with eels.
Well, you're going to talk with us about the American eel, which many people might not even know it actually is a fish and was once the most common fish species found in the Susquehanna River Basin. So tell us more about this unique fish and the importance of restoring and maintaining its population.
Sure. So I figured I'd start out simply enough with what is an eel, because a lot of people may not know. Despite looking a lot like a snake, they're actually a fish, also a migratory fish that needs access to both fresh and salt water. There's 19 species of freshwater eel in the world, but only one native to North America, the American eel. They can grow up to 4 feet long and live to be over 70 years old. This is a picture of a juvenile American eel that's about 3 years old. They're also very strong and rather slimy, but that slime is important as eels have a cool adaptation that allows them to partially breathe through their skin. I mentioned that they're migratory fish that need both salt and fresh water to complete their life cycle. Eels have a really fascinating life cycle that's illustrated in this diagram. American eels are spawned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in a really productive area called the Sargasso Sea. At that point, they're translucent, feather-like larvae called leptocephali. These eels drift with ocean currents back towards the North American coast, where they've now developed into the glass eel stage. Glass eels are still clear in appearance, but have improved swimming and climbing abilities. At this point in their lives, they're encountering fresh water for the first time. They'll start navigating their way upstream, continuing to grow, but developing more pigment to enter the elver stage. Small and energetic, these eels are only 2 to 4 inches long, but can climb near vertical surfaces and even leap out of the water. These are pretty useful adaptations for animals trying to make its way upstream, right? So once they've reached a nice body of water, like say the Susquehanna, they'll reside there for most of their lives, growing through to the yellow eel stage. Male eels stay at this stage and will grow to about 2 feet long, but females will continue growing into the silver eel stage. By this point, the eel has grown to about its maximum size. This particular one in the picture was from Pine Creek. It was about 3 feet long and weighed nearly 3 pounds. Their bodies are beginning to prepare for this long journey to head back to the ocean to reproduce. The silver eel stage and how and when they decide to outmigrate is not well understood yet, but it's something we're actively studying in the Susquehanna. So this is an incredibly complex life cycle that scientists have only recently begun to understand, but we know it's essential for them to access fresh water in the ocean. And this is how the Susquehanna River used to look, full of eels. They were one of the most, if not the most abundant fish in the basin before the construction of dams. Being so plentiful also made them very important. American eels are an incredibly important resource for the indigenous peoples of the region. They're a reliable food source and frequently captured during their out migrations in the fall using large rock weirs that span the width of the river. Those rocks were stacked to form a V shape to direct the eels to the apex where a net, a basket trap, or an angler with a gig or a spear would be waiting to harvest them. These satellite shows show a series of V's across the width of the river from ancient weirs. Most are hundreds or even thousands of years old. When flows are low, they become easier to see in person, but I encourage everyone to explore the riverbed on Google Earth. It's really amazing to see just how many of these are out there. These weir fisheries were still active until at least the 1950s and 60s. These pictures show an old weir being fished near Sunbury. Note the convenience of the gas engine on the boat, but still leaning on the reliability of indigenous techniques to do the fishing. But also, unfortunately, this era also represents the decline of the American eel in the basin. While still being caught in the mid-20th century, these eels were probably some of the last ones to enter this system on their own before the construction of 4 major hydroelectric dams across the lower Susquehanna. So it was the construction of the dams that ultimately led to the decline of eels in the basin. By the 1970s, they were effectively gone as upstream migration wasn't possible. But one of my jobs at SRBC is to evaluate and try to minimize the impact dams have, especially on fish. So every so often, the electricity producing dams have to renew their licenses and permits. This is the time when the negative impacts the dams cause on the environment can be lessened or mitigated. So it's through this relicensing process that hydroelectric projects must undergo the SRBC and those other resource agencies I've mentioned, the Fish and Boat Commission, DEP, Fish and Wildlife Service in Maryland, all work together to try and solve the problem. What we came up with was to try to require the dam owners to operate a trap and transport program to help the restoration. So Elver stage eels are caught in a device called an eel ramp, shown in the top 2 pictures, where they will climb up the ramp or collected into a tank and then trucked upstream around the dams before returning to the river. The ramp itself is pretty simple, just an inclined plane, some artificial substrate, some attraction water running down it. Eels instinctively climb the ramp, looking to keep moving upstream. Then they fall into a collection tank where they're counted before being trucked upriver. And they're trucked in that truck and released back into the water. 2 of these ramps operate every summer from May 1st until early November, one at the base of Conowingo Dam on the Susquehanna River, and another on Octorara Creek. Elvers are trucked daily, and most get released near Harrisburg, but some have been stocked in tributaries around the basin, even as far as New York. The Fish and Wildlife Service began experimentally trapping eels at Conowingo Dam in 2005. They had good years and had some not so good years, but they did determine there were lots of eels trying to get up the river. This graph shows how many elvers were caught each year since then. As you can see, 2021 was our best year by far. We averaged over 3,400 eels per day at Conowingo, and the Octorara ramp was also having its best year ever, catching 45,000 before a record flood event destroyed it in early September. In the last 15 years, over 2.1 million American eel elvers have been caught at these ramps stocked in the basin. As I explained earlier, the vast majority of these eels go right back into the river to resume their upstream migration as they would if the dams weren't there. So as you'd expect, there have been an increasing number of folks catching eels again. We're a long ways from fishing weirs again, but we have seen rapid dispersal of these animals to all corners of the basin, as this map shows. We've even had one capture at the base of Lake Otsego in Cooperstown, New York, which is the beginning of the river, 444 miles from the mouth. One of my projects at SRBC looks at what happens to the aquatic life of the basin after eels return to the watershed. While most eels go back to the river, we stock some in smaller streams so we could study their ecological impact at a finer scale. We are also able to tag eels the same way you would microchip your pet. We implant tiny transmitters about the size of a grain of rice under their skin. Anytime they are scanned, we'll know if they've been caught before, where, and how big they were at that time. It's a useful tool for tracking growth and movement. We've documented eels growing about 4 inches per year, one of the fastest growth rates in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We study eels for a number of reasons. One is that they're one of the least understood fish species. Another is that we know American eels have the potential to improve the water quality of the Susquehanna through their host relationship with freshwater mussels. Freshwater mussels are becoming increasingly rare in the basin, and their decline coincides with the decline of eels. So why is that? Because some mussels, like the eastern elliptio shown below, are examples of how American eels use mussels to complete their life cycle, or how mussels use eels to complete their life cycle. So a mussel can put out a lure that looks like a fish, but it's really just a trick to attract another fish, in this case, an eel that'll try to eat that lure. But when the eel gets close enough, the mussel spits its babies out into a new location before eventually dropping off and growing into a new habitat. So that's how eels can get dispersed. One adult mussel can also filter up to 15 gallons of water a day. So the potential for a natural water filtering system is enormous. If we can restore the eels, hopefully the mussels will follow as well. While we've had relatively good success locally with American eels, the global eel population remains vulnerable and at serious risk of decline. Eels are panmictic and semmelperous, which means just fancy words for say they mate randomly and once in their life. So if an eel grew up in Susquehanna, there's nothing saying it will ever make it back here. This is the opposite of, say, an American shad, which may return to the same place to spawn multiple times during its life. One of the biggest threats to eels is illegal harvest or poaching of glass eels. Glass eels are commercially very valuable, as those baby eels can be captured and grown to large adults to sell for food. Few states have regulated eel fisheries, but illegal harvest is rampant, as the glass eels can be worth thousands of dollars per pound. And also, outmigration remains an issue for eels to overcome before returning to the sea. Although we can truck eels around the dams on the way up, they're much harder to catch and detect moving downstream. Sadly, many end up passing through those hydroelectric dams turbines on the way out, and usually the result is fatal. Not all eels go through the turbines, not all that do perish, but this remains as one of the next big hurdles for the restoration effort. Thankfully, teams of scientists and engineers are working to develop fish-friendly turbines that have less lethal encounters with fish. There are also angled louvers and bar racks that can be installed in front of the turbines to direct eels away from the intakes. And I'm certainly not going to end on this depressing note like that, so I'll take time to introduce my Eels in the Classroom program. This is a limited scale environmental education program I started as a way to try and increase appreciation and awareness of American eels. Basically what I do is provide educators with elder stage eels, those little 4-inchers, to raise in their classrooms throughout the school year. We then release them in the spring, and all while learning about the importance of American eels in the basin. I figured that reaching our younger people who are the future voters and decision makers early and introducing them to this fascinating natural world will instill that level of enjoyment for the rest of their lives. If you're an educator and interested in this project, contact me or visit our website to learn more. That wraps up my presentation on American eels in Susquehanna River Basin. I want to thank the State Museum for having me and also acknowledge my many other partners who all work on eel restoration. This is really a group effort, and I'm just one small part of it. If you'd like to learn more about SRBC eels or eels in the classroom, please see our website. Thank you.
Yes, I did put those links in the chat box, and I'm going to ask now for our audience, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box so that we can pass those on to Aaron and he could answer those questions for us. I have a question to start, Aaron. Are eels dangerous to the general public that use the river for recreation?
Not at all. It might be a little unnerving or unusual to see one, especially if you're fishing for, catfish or bass and you pull up something looking like a snake, but they are not at all a threat to people. Their teeth are not even that sharp. So if you can't unhook it successfully, I would say just cut the line and let them back in the water.
So we're actually getting a lot of questions. And first question is, can you confirm that the name Shamokin means place of many eels?
I can confirm I've heard that. I've also heard the same thing of Swatera. I live pretty close to Swatera Creek, and I had always heard that that was the place where we catch eels. But I've heard the same thing of Shamokin, so I believe those are indigenous terms. So we have a reference book I could probably look more into, but I'm not 100% certain on that. I'm sure there's some element of truth to it, though.
So another listener asked, commented that they look a lot like snakes. And if you're out and see one in the wild, how do you tell if it's an eel or a water-loving snake? Are there discerning features to look for, especially if
Yes.
you don't really see fins or visible gills?
Okay. You probably wouldn't be able to see the gills because it would just be a slit, but you should be able to see their fins. Another thing is you'll almost never see an American eel on land or like basking or, like you would see a snake. You probably typically see a water snake maybe on the edge of the stream, but you're never going to see an eel that's hanging out on the edge of the stream. And also the presence of those pectoral fins right behind their gills, that's going to determine it's a fish from a snake.
So we have a lot of questions regarding their travel, and your presentation was fantastic. The thing I came out of it with was the eel's life cycle is really complicated. So it's a tough one. Like it's amazing that they do survive with all the different stages they have to go through. So one of the questions is, how far south do the eels travel? Do they travel to the Delaware Bay or all the way to the Atlantic?
So they will, out-migrate down the Susquehanna throughout the Chesapeake Bay, and then back out to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Coastwide, they range as far as north into Canada, and then as far south as, I believe, Central America, maybe even South America, close to Venezuela, I believe. But pretty much the entire Atlantic seaboard. And they are abundant throughout the Delaware, as there's no major dams on the Delaware, so there's a lot more eels there.
Another listener asked a similar question about how far up the tributaries do they tend to go from the main Susquehanna River. She's in northern Cambria County, and they have a west branch of the headwaters of the Susquehanna. She's curious if she would see any there.
Right, she absolutely could. One of the points on my map, I believe, is pretty far up the west branch of the Susquehanna. We have also had some pretty far up the Juniata. I mentioned some of those in New York, the one at Lake Otsego. We also had some near Homer, New York, which is very far up, right on the edge of the basin again. So they will, once they hit the water, they just keep swimming upstream pretty much until they hit a blockage.
There's not a question as much as a comment from one of our listeners. She's working on a personal project to identify and record V-shaped fish weirs, later called eel walls. So far, 240 have been identified in the Susquehanna River drainage through Google Earth and historic aerial imagery. Have you heard that as well?
I haven't heard that number, but it doesn't surprise me. I bet there's probably even more. If that person would love to share that GIS layer or however they're documenting those, that's something I'd love to include on our website and share with the public if they're up for it. That's awesome that someone's doing that.
Okay, we can get you connected. One of the big questions is about the Eels in the Classroom program. And I know you and I have talked about it. I think it's a fascinating idea. So one of our listeners wants to get a little bit more information. I will tell the listener that the link is in the chat box for that specific web page that you can go to. But can you talk a little bit more about that program, Aaron?
Sure. It's really only in its third year. We lost a year due to COVID. So like I mentioned, I started out pretty small scale. I think right now we only have maybe 11 classrooms. Realistically, I would probably have to keep it probably under 20, just because the bulk of the eels we're trying to put back in the river for restoration, but we do allocate some for educational purposes. So there's also a bit of experience that go along with it. They're not the easiest keepers, certainly at first. Their initial instinct is to migrate, so they'll try and want to get out of the tank for the first couple days until they calm down. So if you have experience with aquaria, that certainly helps. But in general, there's a form on the website where you can just give me your basic contact information, and I'll put you on a list of people. And I'm just about getting ready to contact everybody I have for next school year. And I have a couple of open slots left, I believe, but not a whole lot. So if you're interested in that, visit the website pretty soon.
A question regarding eel size. What is the largest ever recorded eel?
I think I haven't seen one much bigger than 3 or 3.5 feet in the Susquehanna. I believe in some of the northern climates, they can get up to like 5 or 6 feet long. I think in New Zealand, they have long fin eels, which can get maybe just as long, if not bigger. But for American eels, 4 foot is probably gonna be a really big eel.
And there's a question about sensitivity to water temperatures, and I'm going to add to that, or sensitivity to temperatures or oxygen levels and such that kind of affect them where they choose their habitat?
They're pretty hardy, so they can occupy a variety of habitats, a variety of salinities too. So typically, water quality is not really a constraining variable on their distribution. I would say probably the physical habitat is more important, especially as they become bigger. They really they need some place to hide. They can burrow, so they like big rocks. You find them in big riprap areas, or a lot of times, like this time of year, they'll lay down in the leaf pack on the bottom of a river and just hang out there for the winter.
What do they eat?
They're generalists. They'll eat pretty much everything. They'll eat fish. They'll eat macroinvertebrates. They'll eat crayfish. Certainly, when they're smaller, more macroinvertebrates, but as they get larger, they can certainly consume crayfish and fish.
Now, this is the Susquehanna River Basin area that we're talking about. Are these restoration efforts happening in other river areas like the Schuylkill River?
Well, the Schuylkill is a tributary to the Delaware, so I don't believe they have anything specific to that river system. There's plenty of eels in the Delaware. I know there's probably some blockages on the Schuylkill, but I don't think there's really anything kind of like this scale or scope that I know of within the Mid-Atlantic, at least.
And a couple questions about the dams. There's a Fabra Dam at Sunbury. The question is, does that block eels trying to move upriver?
It potentially can, but we have records of them upstream of a lot of dams. Not the major ones that not Conowingo Dam, that's a 90-foot dam, but smaller lowhead dams don't really seem to be a problem. I don't see the Fabra Dam as a big problem because that's operated seasonally. Plus, as I mentioned, they're pretty good climbers. So if there's some water coming over the dam and it's not a sheer vertical surface, they could probably get up and over it.
One of the listeners wanted to know about the holding time on the eel ramp tank. What is the mortality rate?
We've had less than 0.1% mortality this year in the holding tanks, which was amazing. Occasionally there's transport mortality. It's always been fractions of percentages. We've moved 2.1 million, and I think overall maybe had 10,000 die in the history of the program. It's really a very small number. They hold them usually just for one day. They'll typically do a morning transport throughout the summer. At the beginning or the end of the season, they may do it every other day or every 3 days, because typically there's less of a run. They might only be catching, a few dozen eels, and they're in very large tanks, so they can hold them for another day to, save a little bit of gas. But in the heat of the summer, when they're catching hundreds and thousands a day, they're trucking every single day.
In just a moment, I'm going to ask you a question that someone had about mussels, but I do want to tell our listeners we're actually going to be talking about mussels in March this month. So we'll get that corresponding animal there. But the question is, has there been a corresponding increase in elliptio mussel populations in the Susquehanna Basin with the increase in eel populations?
In short, there has. So I mentioned that we stocked eels in some tributaries. Pine Creek was one of those tributaries that was stocked, almost 10 years ago now. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service specifically looked at the impact to the mussels. And they had documented recruitment, so juvenile mussels showing up that they had not seen before after the eels were brought back. So some pretty recent data that suggests that they are having an impact in improving the recruitment or the number of juvenile eels coming into the next population.
We're getting lots of questions
That's
about
good.
how they pass. Yeah, this is great. Are the eels able to get past Easton into the Lehigh River?
I'm not sure if there's a dam in Easton or how big it is, but yeah, they should be able to get up in the Lehigh.
And how important are they to the striped bass fishery in the river and in the bay?
I know striped bass are big consumers of eels coming up. Striped bass fishermen love to use eels for bait. So there's certainly an interaction there. Being that their population, what you see in the bay might not correspond to what you see in any one tributary or the overall population. It might be a little hard to attribute the impact to it, but certainly plenty of American eels are gobbled up by stripers on their way up through the bay.
And then a question about their lifespan. Did you say that lifespan was about 70 years?
They can. In captivity, I believe they've documented an eel living over 100 years. Typically, in the wild, they'll do their out migrations within 10 to 20 years. So, we've been stocking them now for 15 years or so, and we're starting to see some, increased out migration. So that's kind of on par with that. So the ones on the Susquehanna, you can count on probably staying there 15 to 20 years.
And they only reproduce the one time?
Yep.
Wow.
Reproduce and die.
Yeah. Okay. More questions about how they travel. How far up a shallow tributary will eels go?
They, a lot of times they will go as far up as you can. We get reports from lakes a lot of times, headwater lakes, so one is from a state park lake in Bradford County, which is, it's about as far up in the headwaters as you can get. A state park, the little creek they dammed up there, and they caught them in the lake there. So they will try to go as far up as possible. I think as long as the stream stays wet, they'll stay in it.
Now, you mentioned before that eels are edible. What
Mhm.
do they taste like? Why are they in demand?
I've personally never had it. I know there's a commercial fishery on the Delaware. You can buy smoked eels. I noticed in Asian culture, they're also prized and favored. But I personally haven't had it, so I can't tell you. Sorry.
That's okay. We've had presenters before with a few recipes here and there for some interesting fish. So, but for right now, you cannot fish for eels, or you can?
In Pennsylvania, you actually can. I believe the limit is they have to be over 6 inches, and it's 25 or 50 a day, which I think that really kind of applies more to the Delaware, where they're a lot more abundant and not subject to a restoration effort. So, while legally you could catch them and eat them, I maybe wouldn't suggest it. But if you're real curious, go for it. Give it a try.
I think I'm going to stick with you and avoid the eels for now. More questions about how they are moved around the dams. So how far upstream are the eels trucked? What is the distribution? Who decides? I think basically they just want to follow up about how that program is done.
Right. So there's a group of all those agencies I mentioned. It's called the Eel Passage Advisory Group. We meet monthly to review what's happening in the program, eels we're catching, how we can make improvements, and also annually where we're going to put them. So far, the strategy has been to put the vast majority of them right back into the river, right above the next biggest dam. So the biggest dam, that being York Haven on the river, just south of Harrisburg, we've been putting them in the river in Harrisburg and just, putting them back in and letting them swim up as they would if those dams weren't even there. A small percentage we can dedicate towards targeted studies and stocking some of those tributaries, but of those 2.1 million, I believe 1.7 or 8 million have been stocked straight into the Susquehanna River right around Harrisburg or York Haven.
Thank you. You are not seeing it, but you're getting lots of compliments. We have a lot of listeners who are saying, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
If you are interested in the Eels in the Classroom program or have any other questions regarding this restoration program with eels, you can go to the links that I put in the chat box for srbc.net. There is also some information, I believe, about Native American names that somebody shared as well. That's on the srbc.net. So you can check that. Aaron, thanks so much for being with us today. I really appreciate this and finding out this valuable information.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love doing it.
This is great. So, I thought we were going to go, but there is one more question. Do you have time?
Probably could.
Okay. And it's because it's a good one. Is there a threat to eels or mussels due to changes in water temperature or water levels due to climate change? And that's going to be our last one for today.
Mm.
It's a big one.
That's a huge question. Water levels, probably not. Temperature, it's hard to say because it's, they're pretty adaptable. They can handle a variety of climates, but just the uncertainty of what climate change is doing to freshwater systems, I think kind of throws a monkey wrench in everything we know about, what could happen. So hopefully not, hopefully minimal. It's my best answer. I
like that answer. Thank you. So for those of you who are listening today, we will be sending you a link to the PHMC YouTube page once this video is completed, and you will be able to access it there. We also will be showing it in here in the museum itself in our Nature Lab space. So if you come through the museum, look and see, this might be the program we're showing. I hope that everyone will join us next month. Again, thank you, Aaron. This was great information. I hope everyone will join us again in February for a conversation with Tracy Graziano. She is an award-winning wildlife photographer and filmmaker with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. We're going to talk with her about her experiences documenting animals in their habitats. And as I mentioned in March, we're going to be talking about mussels. So you can visit our webpage to sign up for this and other upcoming virtual Learn at Lunchtime programs. Today's program, again, was recorded, and those of you who have signed up, you'll get a link emailed to you. Otherwise, it'll be available on the PHMC YouTube page. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.